In this edition of George Washington Speaks, George Washington, at the age of 21, began his first military experience as a major in the Virginia militia. The colonial governor, Robert Dinwiddie, sent the young and inexperienced major to approach the French at Fort Le Boeuf, 15 miles south of Lake Erie and over 500 miles northwest of Williamsburg, Virginia. As the British Crown's representative in the Ohio Valley, he delivered a letter to the French commander stating that the British claimed the Ohio Valley and the French must leave. At the time, the Ohio Valley was still the frontier and largely unsettled by either the French or English, but both laid claim to the area. The French claim to the area was based on the journeys of explorers Louis Joliet and Jacques Marquette, which dated back to 80 years to 1673. They explored the land from what is now the Canadian border to the Gulf Coast, which they named the Louisiana Territory for King Louis XIV. The British knew they wanted to continue their expansion westward to harvest the rich timberlands, to prosper from the fur trapping, and to cultivate farmlands for their expanding population. The heavily forested mountains, hills, valleys, and wetlands had no roads or bridges which could be insurmountable barriers. However, with access along the waterways of the Ohio Valley, along the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio rivers, that westward progress would be possible. The French challenged the English ambitions by building 3 forts running south from Lake Erie and had plans to build several more down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. In choosing Major Washington to be the Crown's messenger, Governor Dinwiddie had been more impressed with his family's pedigree than with his military abilities. Washington had 2 older half-brothers. The more accomplished was his oldest brother, Lawrence, who was 14 years older than George. After their father passed when George was just 11, Lawrence became his father figure. Lawrence was the adjutant general for the militia of Northern Virginia and served as a member of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. He was widely known and highly respected in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Both of George's stepbrothers, Lawrence and Augustine, had wanted him to join the Royal Navy, but it was rejected by George's mother, Mary Ball Washington. Instead, George became a surveyor, and despite his youth, he earned a strong reputation as a competent and fair surveyor. It was the family name and his experience in surveying and trekking that ultimately led Governor Dinwiddie to give him the commission and to deliver the letter to the French commander when he was just 21. Washington tells the story of his commissioning in a journal he wrote and published. It described many of the details of his journey and captured the attention of those in the colonies and as far away as England. But, more importantly, publication of his journal began to draw attention to the previously unknown George Washington. Among those on the expedition was tracker Christopher Gist, an experienced explorer, surveyor, and frontiersman. Gist's own father was a famous surveyor who laid out the streets and building blocks of the city of Baltimore. Gist's knowledge of the frontier and his deep understanding of the native Indian people brought many skills and insights that were rare in those days and later proved to be invaluable to young Washington. 3 years beforehand, in 1750, the Ohio Company hired Gist to survey along the Ohio River, so he was the ideal person to accompany Washington on this journey. Let's hear from Gist and Washington in their own words about their trek.
Young Washington was ambitious and smart, but at the beginning, I found him lacking in the practical matters so essential to survival in the wilderness. He was unfamiliar with the terrain and would often choose the shorter but more difficult routes through the deep woods. He was an excellent horseman and surveyor. He carried the rank of major, but at the beginning of our journey into the Ohio country, I always had the sense he was trying to prove himself. That could be a dangerous thing in the deep wilderness in the dead of winter. I remember when I was his age, I was also fearless and short on experience. My father was a famous surveyor in his time, and I lived in his shadow. I was able to find my own way. That's one of the reasons I took this mission, to help a promising young man find his way, not just to complete the mission, but to help a young Washington grow up.
I received my commission at age 21 from Governor Robert Dinwiddie to approach the French who had been moving into the Ohio Territory and robbing English traders in the region. This was a very large area that included the land from Lakes Ontario and Erie southward along the Allegheny, Ohio, and Monongahela river systems. In the 1750s, the area was claimed by both the English and the French, and those rivers were important to the trade in the area. The Monongahela and Allegheny rivers gave both access into the rich fur lands and provided much easier transportation of goods and people. French control of the valley would have blocked the British expansion to the west. Christopher Gist, Jacob von Braun, and I left Williamsburg in October 1753 as winter was approaching. Von Braun was a family friend who had served under my older stepbrother and who spoke French, which would be helpful as we would encounter the French at Fort Boeuf. We were accompanied by 3 porters and pack animals to help carry out provisions and equipments through the wilderness. The first part of the journey took us to Logstown, where we were able to learn the locations of the French. From there, we traveled to Venango, the first French fort, where we met members of many tribes, including the Mingos, Shawnee, and Delawares. We also had the pleasure of meeting Tenachtaron, a Seneca who was chosen by the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois Confederation, to represent the tribes living in the region. Tenachtaron was, well, you might say, a difficult person. He was headstrong and always wanted to be treated as if he were important. He was given the title of half-king by the British, since he had limited authority. He could only represent the tribes on certain matters, not things that required a council of the leaders of the various tribes. Nevertheless, he became an important ally for us and in our conflict with the French.
In early December, we arrived at Fort Boeuf on the south side of Lake Erie in a terrible snowstorm. For the next few days, the French did their very best to capture the loyalty of our Indians, who were our guides, by plying them with liquor, giving them gifts, and making them promises. Washington was greatly concerned, but even though the Indians accepted the gifts, they held fast to their loyalty to us. The French commander, Captain Jacques Lagarde de Saint-Pierre, graciously welcomed us, but when he read Governor Dinwiddie's demand that the French leave the area, he proceeded to write a reply emphasizing that the French king's claim to the Ukiah Valley was incontestable. We were delayed several more days as the French commander continued to try to sway the Indians on the French side. Tanakarison and his braves continued to receive the gifts, but they had no intention of switching sides. Washington was very eager to report back to Governor Dinwiddie, and when he demanded that they leave, he and Tanakarison quarreled loudly. By the time we left, the weather had become colder and more snow began to fall. Washington was relieved that we were on our way, but he couldn't have known the life-threatening situations we'd face on our return journey.